Last year, I visited the American Museum of Tort Law in Winstead, Connecticut. It was founded by Ralph Nader about 10 years ago. Tort law is the law of wrongful injuries. And if I make any mistakes here, I hope that the lawyers in the congregation will correct me later. It is the law at play when someone is hurt by negligence or recklessness. The museum presents famous tort cases like Liebeck versus McDonald's, the 1994 case of a 79-year-old woman who spilled coffee on her lap. That case received mocking attention, but the coffee was so dangerously hot that it caused third-degree burns through her clothes in under 3 seconds, requiring skin grafts and hospitalization for 8 days. Or Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company, a tort suit about the Pinto, a car infamous in the 1970s for bursting into flames if hit in a certain way in a collision. As I walked through the museum, I thought about Torah and oxen. Because yes, Judaism too has tort law, millennia of thinking about negligence, recklessness, and what we owe one another. Studying a society's laws is one good way to understand its values. As liberal Jews, we study Talmud because our sacred texts reveal the concerns of earlier Jewish communities and often articulate the values we still hold today. This morning, I'll discuss 3 stages of Jewish thinking about tort law: biblical, rabbinic, and contemporary. The foundation of Jewish tort law is, of course, in the Torah, specifically from this week's parsha, Mishpatim, which means, fittingly, rules. The rabbis of the Mishnah, Gemara, and medieval period would go on to concretize the values expressed in the Torah into an effective legal system. Later, we can consider an opportunity to apply Judaism's ancient wisdom to our world today. First, the biblical. In this week's parsha, which Rabbi Khan just chanted for us, Mishpatim, we read, "When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, but the owner of the ox is not to be punished." Fair enough. The ox is killed. We can't take the risk that this happens again, but otherwise, we move on, accepting that sometimes disasters do happen. The parasha continues, though. If, however, that ox had been in the habit of goring, and its owner, though warned, has failed to guard it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner too shall be put to death. This concept, the average ox versus the habitually goring ox, becomes the foundation for Jewish tort law. If the owner knew that his ox was dangerous and he had been told to secure it, but he did not take the necessary precautions, did not fence the ox in or tie it up, then the owner is culpable if the ox gets out and gores someone to death. The owner of the habitually goring ox must take more safety precautions than the owner of the average ox. This probably feels intuitively right to us. In New York, we don't expect all dogs to wear muzzles, but a dangerous dog who has attacked a person before may be required to wear a muzzle on public premises. And if the owner refuses to take safety precautions and the dog attacks again, the owner faces higher liability. From the biblical oxen, the rabbis of the Mishnah draw out a broader principle. A person is liable for damages caused by anything for which they are responsible. In all sorts of ways, we must take care with the things we own, borrow, and sell. Long before Ralph Nader popularized the concept of consumer protection, Maimonides taught that a seller must tell potential buyers about any known blemishes in the object they are considering. We have an obligation of disclosure. We are also responsible for vetting buyers of our potentially unsafe items. If a person sells an untethered ox to someone of limited competence, such as a child, and the ox causes damage, The seller is responsible. Halakha prohibits us from selling dangerous items to people likely to handle them irresponsibly. Elsewhere, the Talmud explores a person's specific liability when selling weapons. The Gemara states, "It is prohibited to sell weapons to a listim, a bandit, a robber. We cannot sell weapons to people likely to kill. If someone is a known criminal, and even if they have not used lethal violence before, we cannot sell them weapons." The Gemara explains why. Sometimes, the listim makes use of his weapon to save himself when he is caught. A criminal's instinct for self-defense, combined with their greater chances of being in hostile situations, may well escalate into violence. We cannot sell weapons to criminals because the potential for death is just too high. So the Torah establishes a baseline, and the rabbis draw out inference and principle. And with this as background, we come to today. There has been a long-standing federal law in the United States prohibiting people under domestic violence restraining orders from owning guns. And earlier this month, the Fifth Circuit overturned that law, ruling that the prohibition was unconstitutional. Now, someone whom a court has determined is a credible threat to the physical safety of an intimate partner or child can nonetheless legally own firearms in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. This came about after a Supreme Court ruling last summer that established a new test for assessing the constitutionality of gun laws. Now, any restriction on gun ownership must be consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. In 1788, when the US Constitution was ratified, there were no laws prohibiting domestic abuse. It was not until 1871 that Alabama and Massachusetts would become the first states to introduce laws against wife-beating. And so, finding no precedent from the 18th century prohibiting domestic abusers from buying guns, the Fifth Circuit ruled that they cannot be denied their Second Amendment rights. Maybe the Supreme Court should look even further back in legal history, because by the 6th century, if not earlier, our rabbis understood that there existed a type of person, the listim, too dangerous to be sold weapons. A woman is 5 times more likely to be killed by her abuser if there is a gun at home. Domestic abuse is also correlated with mass shootings, and especially the deadliest mass shootings. A Bloomberg study of mass shootings between 2014 and 2019 found that in shootings with 6 or more deaths, 70% of perpetrators had a history of domestic violence. I believe that the listim of Jewish tradition is a category that includes domestic abusers. I am disappointed that the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court majority weren't able to view decisions about gun ownership more broadly, more thoughtfully. People with a court-documented history of interpersonal violence are unfit to own guns. That is what I know from my Jewish values, the values I derive from our ancient wisdom. In Parashat Mishpatim, we first see the exhortation, Kol almana veyatom lo ta'anun, you shall not mistreat the widow or the orphan. The specifics of which people are vulnerable changes over time. The Torah might not explicitly list victims of domestic violence among categories of vulnerable people like widows and orphans. The Torah doesn't know about guns or gun violence. And 6th century rabbis might not connect domestic abuse with the violence that typifies a listim. But we do. We internalize the lessons of Torah and continue along the moral pathways established by our tradition with nuance and wisdom. The principle behind the laws of the habitually goring ox and refusing the sale of weapons to a listim will always hold. We must protect the vulnerable from those likely to harm them. That is what it means to be a Jew in the 21st century. We apply millennia-old moral principles to our ever-expanding understanding of who deserves justice and safety. That is the eternal core teaching of Judaism.